Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me and hopefully watching and enjoying this video. If you're new here, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any greenhouses or equipment, humidifiers, heat. Just me and them either inside or outside, or we don't play at all. So plant lovers, if that sounds like your kettle of fish, do hit subscribe. I post every Friday and I am a complete amateur trying to figure out how and what and where to grow for me, and perhaps it might help you too. And today's glorious subject matter, I know there's only one spike, but there is a bit of a tale to tell around this orchid, and it is so beautiful that here we are. We're going to make a video about this. Now, what is it, I hear you cry? Well, let me tell you what I bought it as. It had this tag, Epidendrum floribundum. But guess what, plant lovers? Casually Googling to see what on earth it was, I unearthed a hotbed of confusion around this orchid and just what it is. But I think what we can firmly establish is that it is not the species Epidendrum floribundum. No, it is a primary hybrid, so it's a cross between two species. And I think it is called Epicyclia Mabel Kanda, and I have written my name on the back of the other name, which I don't think is correct. And having a little Google around, it seems that everyone has this same confusion. Anyway, it also seems that this whole group of plants, the species parents of this sort of group of epidendrums, has undergone all manner of botanical investigations and divisions and subgrouping and renaming and regrouping. So it's quite a hotbed of nomenclatorial confusion, which for someone like me drives me to distraction. I would just like a simple name. Anyway, this is what I think we're going to call it. And if it is this, which I think it is derived from two ancestors, which are Epidendrum paniculatum, which is also sometimes known as Epidendrum floribundum, and it's that group of orchids that has undergone all manner of investigations and subgrouping. But that is a high altitude Peruvian orchid, actually to quite high altitudes. So it is a cold to cool grower, has this cane-like growth habit, but a slightly different, well, quite a different flower actually. But first thing to remember is that is a cool cold grower. And the other parent is Encyclia cordigera, which is much more widespread throughout Central America. And that, plant lovers, is a hot to warm grower from much lower elevations, basically sea level and not that much higher. Quite mixed ancestry. And why is all this important, you may ask? Well, it's kind of important to know the name, but it's really important because of the care. So I have had this orchid now for 2 years. And I made a mistake in year one, which I didn't make in year two. And look, we have a flower spike. So that rambling about heritage and who do you think you are is quite important because it does play a role in how you're growing the orchids. Now, as I said in my preamble, which someone once complained was getting repetitive, so forgive me, is that I grow orchids, what is known in Australia as cold. So outside, undercover, but with no heating and sort of open to this side. So I have a polycarbonate roof, but no sides, if you know what I mean. So it's not a shade house, not a greenhouse, not a cool house. It's almost just like a veranda with a transparent roof. It does get warmer under there, but it does allow cold air to breeze through. And in winter, it can get quite low here in the inner city of Melbourne. So we can get down to 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees centigrade as a minimum in winter. On the coldest of nights, luckily it's not that common that we go that low. So that is about 36 to 42 Fahrenheit. So cold but not freezing. So that then alters the whole paradigm about this orchid. If this was the species that is that high altitude South American epiphyte, then it would love growing outside in Melbourne, undercover in those conditions. But if, which I think it is, it's the hybrid, which has half of its DNA is a much lower, warmer lover, then growing it outside is not going to be an option. And I made that mistake in year one. But before we get into the care, let's look at the plant. It is absolutely beautiful, very, very vigorous. So firstly, look at all those canes. Now, from a growing habit, it actually reminds me quite a lot of Australian dendrobium orchids like Dendrobium kingianum or the habit of Dendrobium delicatum, quite vigorous leaves at the top and producing numerous new growths every season. So a really vigorous plant. However, the flowers bear no resemblance, although I guess it flowers from the top of last year's matured cane. So there's actually kind of what Australian dendrobiums do. Maybe they are very, very distantly related in our Gondwana past. So you have these vigorous canes and you get multiple growths each year. That cane matures, and from the top of the cane you get a flower spike, and the flower spike can branch. And I noticed that mine made an attempt to branch and it's missing, so something happened there. But maybe because it's the first year flowering and it's just getting into its groove with me. I do, though, which fills me with joy, have a second spike coming out here, which I'll zoom in and show you. So what we have in a sort of a growth habit is you get a cane, it matures. The following year, once it is grown up and full of the lust for life, it will then bloom. And what you can see at the back here, which I'll come in and show you, are the spent spikes from previous flowering incarnations. And each cane only flowers once, so you won't get multiple flowerings from the same cane, which is different to Australian Dendrobium kingianum and delicatum, because they will multiply flower from the same cane, and the canes can last years and years and years and happily bloom. So this one is slightly different, which would suggest perhaps that you could also, should you wish, prune out the old canes, but I really wouldn't until they had died. Anyway, a vigorous plant, and because of its vigor and because each cane will produce one hopefully branching spike, you will hopefully ultimately get quite a massive specimen relatively quickly. So I had a few setbacks with this, which does relate back to our tedious story about ancestry, but I basically got 2 canes to mature in this last year, and they both produced a flower spike for me. So that makes me very happy. But just one more thing then about the growth. If you look at the roots, they are quite vigorous and sort of creeping along the top. Now, there's also a huge amount of root activity in the pot because the medium, which is a medium bark, is really densely held together by the roots. It's not movable. You know, in lots of orchids, the bark is still quite movable to your finger. Well, this is not. It's tightly bound by roots. And if I try to get the tag in, it won't go because there's a lot of tight root activity. So vigorous roots, vigorous growth, which probably also means it's going to be really tricky to repot. I might have to smash this baby out. That won't happen for quite some time because, like many epiphytes, and both the ancestors of this are epiphytes, they do like to be potted in the smallest pot that will take the root ball. And this, if anything, is over potted. And most orchids don't like that, but this one doesn't seem to mind it. And because I knew it was going to be really vigorous, I did put it in a slightly larger pot than necessary. So I'm going to get quite a few years of hopefully great orchid growing cycles out of this before the canes reach the edge of the pot and it's going to need to be repotted. And just to give you an indication of the vigor of this baby, let's count the new growths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 5 new growths, and we're sort of in late spring, so there is still a chance that there might be more canes coming as the season progresses, because some of them are really quite small and have only just emerged. So one of those plants where you need to encourage vegetative growth, because it's those new growths that will give you the beautiful, beautiful flowers that you desire. Other quick basic care then, as I mentioned, I potted this in a medium bark and a medium bark only, nothing else. No sphagnum or perlite, just medium bark because it's got vigorous roots. It's an epiphyte, it will go for it. So you don't need to fuss too much, just bung it in some bark and let it go. So in terms of flowers, you have this spike that emerges from the top of the mature cane, and I've seen images of amazing inflorescences covered in blooms. Mine though isn't quite there yet, but I think it will be. But what is most fabulous about this is that the Encyclia relative, which is no surprise because Encyclias generally are famed for their fragrance, it has the most beautiful, light, delicate, if you could sort of cross vanilla with maybe apple blossom with maybe a jonquil, I don't know, very light, very spring fresh fragrance. It's absolutely beautiful. Ah, so if you love fragrant orchids, you should definitely try and find this. And it probably will be sold as Epidendrum floribundum, but you know it's going to be Epicyclia Mabel Kanda, allegedly. So now let's get to the whole weather thing and how do you look after this baby? Well, I would say this orchid is a prime candidate for perfect indoor growing, unless you are somewhere tropical or subtropical, which I am not. So if I were living in Sydney, for example, this orchid could live outside all year. But I don't. I live in Melbourne, where it is much colder and wetter in winter. So if you are in a similar climate to mine or colder, then you may as well just grow this inside. All it needs is bright indirect light. So here in Australia, in the southern hemisphere, near a north-facing window, which is where most of the light comes from, a bit of diffusion through a curtain or something, a bit further back from the window is perfect. In the northern hemisphere, it will be a southern-facing window, ditto, same conditions, bit of a blind or a curtain just to filter it a little bit. Bright indirect light, Bob's your uncle. It's not that tricky. It's not an orchid that craves special care and humidity and misting and all that jazz. It just does its thing. Generally, I find the humidity of your house, you know, you've got the kettle boiling and the shower going. Generally, the humidity is it's fine for orchids, unless you've got particularly drying central heating in winter, in which case it might be a bit low in humidity, but for me here, it is not. So this orchid has thrived really well this year. So last year, thinking it was this species and thinking it's a high altitude cool grower, which really suit my outside conditions. So those high altitude orchids from South America and from the Himalayan region, and there's all manner of orchids that fit that bill, including Masdevallia and Sologenes and Cymbidiums and Holcoglossums and many other things. They love Melbourne outside. The summer can be a bit tricky because it does get hot, so I do have to make sure I mist and spray outside to keep the temperature down and humidity up on particularly hot days. But they do love and thrive in our winter. So I assumed this would be the same. No, plant lovers, no, because we have that warm, loving ancestry. Now, I didn't kill it, as you can see, because here it is. But what did happen, and you can actually perhaps see some evidence here. This is just a cane with nothing on it and a bit truncated, because I had to cut the top off because it rotted. Now, rule 101 with orchids, no matter what, is they don't like generally to be cold and wet, because all manner of dark arts can then start weaving their magic on your orchids, from fungal infections to rot to all manner of things. And that is what happened with this one. It obviously got water in the crown and the top of the cane started to rot. Of course, you panic in those circumstances. There's no need to, though. I mean, what can you do ultimately? Because it was so vigorous, one of the canes I just cut off. The other one I just cut the affected bit off and the cane remained, because I thought, well, that cane might actually still have the energy and the wherewithal to send up new shoots in spring. It didn't, but hey-ho. So this orchid does not like cool weather. Now, perhaps if I'd been more careful and hadn't got it wet, or as wet as it was, it would have sailed through. And I do know people that grow an orchid that looks like this, probably the same one, do grow it outside. So if I was a little more careful, it perhaps would have thrived. But you know what? I'm just not going to worry about that anymore. I have decided that this is an indoor in winter grower and then outdoor in summer, where it can get all that ambient heat and moisture and breeze and insect infestation to its heart's content. And so in fact now, well, perhaps not now. Yesterday it was summer in Melbourne. Today it is very early spring again. So the temperature plummeted today, but whatever. The nighttime minimums are all basically now above or at 10 degrees centigrade, which is 50 Fahrenheit. And that's kind of like the golden mean for orchids. Generally, they will be okay to 10 degrees centigrade, 50 Fahrenheit. Below that, a lot don't thrive. It's sort of the tipping point. Many do thrive cooler than that, but certain things don't. Anyway, I don't think this one really loved getting below 10 degrees centigrade. So I'm just going to keep it inside. Very simple. And I've got a great north-facing spot, plenty of diffused light, and of course it has stimulated it to flower from 2 of its spikes. But now I am going to move it outside where it can get a bit warmer and a bit more variable conditions until the temperatures in autumn start to drop below 10 degrees centigrade, 50 Fahrenheit again. In it will come, because I'm not going to make the same mistake twice. So what happened, I killed all of the new canes because I guess they were the softest and most susceptible to any sort of airborne problem. The older canes survived and sailed through the conditions. So I think, if I had looked after it better, it probably would be okay. But anyway, I nurtured it over winter and we got lots of new growth, and here we are. I think I did set it back, but I feel that we're now on to a good run with lots of new growth. So I'm hoping next year I'll get multiple spikes at the same time. So then the only other thing, I guess, is fertilizing, and pretty similar to all my other orchids. So in spring, I give it a topical dressing of a slow release general fertilizer for flowering plants. And then during the growing season, maybe every 3 waterings, I use a liquid fertilizer of some sort. And I really do mix it up. I don't use the same thing all the time because, just like me, I don't like to eat the same thing every day. I don't think orchids do. I think a varied diet is good for everyone. So I use a liquid general fertilizer. I use a liquid orchid-specific fertilizer. I use tonics, which can be a seaweed-based solution or the runoff from worm farms, which is worm juice or worm tea, I don't know. People often get a bit confused about what I'm talking about, but it's the runoff for a worm farm, which you sort of decant. You have a little bottle of it, and then you dilute that to about 1/10. So with all of these liquid fertilizers, I dilute it more than it says on the bottle, sort of 1/8, 1/10 of the recommended dose, and just keep it a bit lean, keep it mean. And so I mix it up over the summer. And in summer, in fact, most of the year, all my orchids are in the same spot on the landing, and I'll link my grow space video so you can see exactly what I mean. As I'm mooching past with a cup of tea, I give them all a bit of a mist. Not though if it's a particularly cold day in winter. I do only do that when it's bright and a bit warmer, so that, again, nothing sinister can happen. But you can see the flowers are really, really beautiful. They sort of had these lime green petals and sepals, and then this fabulous lip, which is a very pale lilac with a much sort of stronger purple stripe and sort of little wings at the side. Very, very delicate, and it looks very Encyclia-like, the actual shape and form of the flower. It's quite small. It's about the size in Australia of a 20-cent coin. What would that be? I don't know. Anyway, maybe a 10p piece. They're not huge, put it that way, but you do get a lot of them, and I think mine is in the early days of its blooming trajectory for me, so I am hoping to get more. So obviously when you get more spikes covered in multiple blooms, it will look really fabulous. Anyway, I'm looking forward to that. The thing though is, I do like the delicate sort of combination of really, really lime green, apple lime green, with that sort of magenta-y bit in the middle, and the fragrance. It's really beautiful. So in a nutshell, plant lovers of the world, it is quite a simple orchid to grow, as long as you just manage that winter cool wetness. Don't get it wet and don't get it cold, or don't get it cold and wet, put it that way. And I think pretty common advice for any orchid, but that is what undid me last year. So there we are, plant lovers. Isn't it a beauty? I bought this at a nursery in Melbourne called Fitzroy Nursery, randomly. Never seen it there since, and actually never seen it for sale anywhere else, so there you are. And that nursery is one of the few places in Melbourne where you can go and buy unusual, or sort of not that common, flowering orchids. So you can buy Cymbidiums and Phalaenopsis in Australia basically anywhere in hardware stores. Anything other than that, bit tricky to find in bloom. But this nursery is one of the places where you can, and they buy things from random smaller growers. So I bought from there, for example, a Psychopsis orchid, which was beautiful. I immediately killed it. Well, I didn't. I killed it about 6 months later, but beautiful. I still have 2 Psychopsis. Oh my goodness. They are, well, I've made a film about them thinking I was the world's expert on them, but anyway, they're still going strong, waiting for a new flower spike. Moral of the story is you never know what's going to turn up, and buy it when you see it, because I've never seen it since. Anyway, I have another spike, as I said, coming out here, which is quite a ways off this one, which is kind of good because I think these flowers are quite long lasting, but by the time this one is starting to fade, that other spike will come into its own. And then next year I've got all these new growths, so I'm very, very hopeful. So as long as I just maintain my watering regime, I do obviously dial the watering down in winter and dial it up in summer so that it's sort of moistish and there's lots of humidity going on. Not dissimilar to most other orchids. You know, I'm pretty much a generalist when it comes to care, I have to say. I do like things that take standard care, you know, not much water in winter, a little bit more in summer. And this one, I hope, is going to be a firm favourite. Well, there we are, plant lovers. Do let me know what you think. If you have any insights onto the name too, I don't want to go down the whole botanical minefield of the species groups. I really don't, because to be quite honest, I'm not that interested. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, you really can. Just Google this and go to orchidspecies.com and look at Epidendrum floribundum and begin your massive investigation into just what this is, or anyway, what its ancestors were. But if you grow this or recognize it, do let me know, because I am very curious. The flowers look like many other things, but I believe that it is Epicyclia Mabel Kanda, and it was bred in Hawaii in the late 50s, I think, by Shimamoto, which was a very famous orchid nursery and a great cultivator of hybrids and cultivars of many, many types of orchids. So I guess there you go. Hawaii's pretty damn tropical, so should give you a clue as to why this didn't really love Melbourne's winter. There we are, plant lovers. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this ramble. I've really loved seeing this orchid bloom and get over its setback. The thing about orchids is if you do set them back, it takes at least a year to recover. Anyway, sometimes two, but I'm glad this one, I think it's a vigorous, perky beast, and it's just shrugged off my lack of judgment and it's gone for it this year. So I hope next year will be even better. And what might be even better is my video next week. Who knows what it will be? If you want to find out, do hit subscribe and the notification bell, and you will know exactly what is going on in my amateur orchid world. But until then, plant lovers of the world, take care wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you next week.